Okay. Welcome to this École de Modernités lecture. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being with us online. We are very happy tonight to welcome Nada Shabout, who's next to me. Thank you, Nada, for being here in Paris, because it's so much different to actually be able to meet and to listen to what you'll be seeing. Nada Shabout is a professor of art history and the coordinator of the Contemporary Arab and Muslim Cultural Studies Initiative at the University of North Texas. She's also the founding president of the Association for Modern and Contemporary Art from the Arab World, Iran and Turkey, and the founding director of Modern Art Iraq Archive, and among other things, she's a curator. I will just mention two of her books as an author. Modern Arab Art, Formation of Arab Aesthetic, published in 2007. And Nada Shabout was also the coordinator of the groundbreaking publication Modern Art in the Arab World, Primary Documents, published by the MoMA in 2018. Tonight's lecture is devoted to the Baghdad group that some of you might already, of course, know, but I think it's not enough discussed, and possibly through the aspects that Nada will develop tonight or pass through tonight. That is the passing by Paris by those artists. The Baghdad group was formed in 1951 by Jewad Selim and Shakir Hassan Al Said, as you might know. And I won't say more about this progressive path that those artists made possible in the formation of modern art in the Arab world. But I'll just go through Nada's title, The Baghdad Group for Modern Art, Shaping Modernism in Iraq Through Affinities and Congruities. So we'll see what those affinities and congruities look like. Thank you again very much, Nada, for you being here, for accepting this lecture, and for your introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Jacomati Institute for the invitation, and to you, Hugo, and the team for making this possible. I wasn't, like I was saying, I wasn't going to pass an occasion, a reason, an excuse to be in Paris, even though, I mean, I don't know, and I thought 2 days in Paris will be enough for me to see a lot of things, but clearly, you know, I was mistaken. So, but I will be back, I hope. I am delighted to be here and in Paris talking about modernism in Iraq. My talk today draws on from continuous and evolving research. As art historians, we look at objects and their historical context to understand their meaning and making in history. Archival material and accessibility has always been the obstacle for of Iraq specifically and the larger region as a whole. Thus, new archival material that we now have access to allows for advanced understanding. And this is something, you know, very new. We were just talking earlier how difficult research in about Iraqi art is, because you know, things are mostly in Arabic, and also they're hard to access. So, the Tate modern website definition of modernism states, modernism refers to a global movement in society and culture that from the early decades of the 20th century sought a new alignment with the experience and values of modern industrial life. Building on late 19th century precedents, artists around the world used new imagery, materials, and techniques to create artworks that they felt better reflected the realities and hopes of modern societies, end of quote. While this definition refers to modernism as global, we can easily unpack words like industrial and the time reference, early decades of 20th century, within the definition to see that for the most, what it represents is still unresolved. As an art movement and philosophy, it remains largely seen as a European development that is, moreover, yet to consider its links and dependence on imperialism. Globalization and decolonization's efforts notwithstanding, art historian Kyra Cabanas is correct to argue that, I quote, "The expansion into a so-called global modern art history is that it mainly operates within an assimilationist logic," end of quote. For us art historians trained in and writing from the so-called West, this is even more challenging as we try to contest the construct from within, but mostly with the same vocabulary and methodologies. So at this point of my career, and this is something that has occupied me for the last maybe 30 years of my life, and really pretty much directed my career and shift from architecture to the art history, to the history of art, I would like to propose that modernism primarily entails a global crisis of representation, with the circumstances of that crisis, the specific forms it takes, and the artistic solution devised to respond to it, varying from one part of the world to another. While not the first or last crisis of its kind, this one was directly caused by modernity and addresses representation as the means of depicting or portraying a subject with its connection to a shifting reality and originality, as specifically distinct from pre-modern representation. In Colonizing Egypt, Timothy Mitchell defines modernity by a change in the perception between a new structure of representation and what he refers to as presentation, which assumes the existence of reality. For example, in Europe, with the invention of photography, advancement in science and technology challenged the construction of the image and the depiction of reality, forcing a shift of representation. As such, I accept that the source of modernism is one and the same, with no center of origination, i.e., modernity, for example, what I mean is modernity is linked to more than one specific occurrence, but rather a series of modernity is not linked to just one specific occurrence, but rather a series of events that could be traced to several moments in history around the world. Modern art would then be understood within a broad, non-linear, a non-chronological web of intersections and overlaps that are dialectical and discursive, that can encompass global influences, as well as account for the continuity of other artistic traditions and their rupture. This understanding of modernism allows us to recognize each particular and peculiar experiment around the world within its own context and significance, with no concern to the linearity or heterochronicity of the history of art. In this sense, modernism is global insofar that it is an occurrence that happens everywhere, but its negotiations are very particular and distinct, despite certain intersections based on historical interactions. Thus, beyond the general reference to modernism, we need to always qualify European, Japanese, Arab, etc., to speak of its specifics. They are all provincialized while equally global. This argument also refutes the notion of a birth of modernism in the Arab world resulting from colonialism or another interaction with the West. It also allows us to understand the postmodern and post-secular and the secular as particular historical conditions that vary in their reasons and details and not universal or global occurrence. So, what does that mean when we speak of Iraqi modernism? I'm going to show you a couple of slides that actually have, I find them very useful for my students, so I hope you find them as useful. They show you sort of a timeline of the development of modern Baghdad. Most of the world knows Baghdad, the historical city. That was specifically apparent in the, leading and through the invasion in 2003. Everyone spoke about, Abbasid Baghdad, historical Baghdad, ancient, Iraq. But, the modern Baghdad is less known. The crisis for modern Iraqi artists was rooted in the inability of the traditional modes of representation inherited from the Islamic period to depict their contemporary reality. In other words, a convergence of historical conditions both inside and outside of art, along with the destabilization of belief in the existing forms of expression in relation to the wider changes within society, affected art's capacity to depict the world. Notwithstanding colonization and the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, the conception of what art does was severely challenged by the secularization of all domains of daily life that caused artists to question the usefulness of the so-called Islamic art as a viable mode of presentation. Iraqi artists of the mid-20th century thought of modern art as a global active space of shared humanity. Many, having studied modern art in art academies, mostly in Europe, and visited their ancient collections in European museums, they understood its civilizational roots. They were thus eager to negotiate their own contribution to its development, particularly as it pertains to building their new nation of Iraq with its distinctive culture. I imagine there will be much evidence of such contribution in the exhibition that will open at the Musée d'Art Moderne, that's co-curated by Mourad Montazami, that will open in a few days, Présence Arabes, that I had the pleasure of touring early today before everyone else. Conscious of the role in the newly formed independent nation, they embarked on creating new structures and art traditions that would be capable of expressing theirs and Iraq's new aspiration. As part of the process of decolonizing, Iraqi artists' visual negotiation were based on engagements with select episodes of Iraqi history and their synthesis to achieve what they believed constituted the Iraqiness of the diverse fractions of society. They were specifically interested in representing the pluralistic whole within a multifaceted identity. The 1930s and 1940s were seminal decades for the acceptance and development of modern art consciousness in Iraq. During these 2 decades, Friends of the Arts and art groups were formed, and a generation of Iraqi artists known as the Pioneers, who were based mostly in Baghdad, launched different activities for introducing modern responses to their problem of representation. The National Museum of Iraq, the Museum of Antiquity, was established earlier in 1926. And I'm not going to talk about the role of people like Gertrude Bell or the perception of what Iraqi art was for the British mandate at the time. Do that somewhere else, some other time. The Syrian-Iraqi educator Sat al-Husari, who was appointed the General Director of Education in Iraq in 1921, was a pivotal figure in constructing a national consciousness during Iraq's transformation from an Ottoman province to a modern state based on the notion of Arabism. Al-Husari later became the Director General of Antiquity. His involvement in both education and the museum granted him much influence on modern Iraqi artists who studied art on government scholarships in Europe and worked in the National Museum when they returned. He and the growing interest in antiquities helped to introduce and encourage young artists to study ancient Iraqi and Islamic art through involvement in preservation projects, thus instigating new understanding to their past and developments in style and concepts. As such, this period decisively prepared the context for the generation of artists that matured during the so-called golden age of the 1950s in Iraq, a group often referred to as the pioneers of modernism, another term that we need to sort of, move away from because, the pioneers sort of, makes one think that they're the first who started this, and it's an evolution. And of course, they were not. There was nothing before them, but they were pivotal in charting new possibilities. Artists of the 1950s had to come to terms with the lack of a perceived understanding of their history of representation and its connection to their contemporary existence and reality. Despite gross economic inequality, social confrontations, and external political pressures, the 1950s became a period of potentials leading to better life. Artists thus were challenged on two fronts: constructing points of continuity within Iraq visual history, the ancient civilization of Mesopotamia and the successive Islamic periods such as the Abbasid and Ottoman, something they shared with all of the post-colonial endeavors, while simultaneously partaking in the creation of the new forms of representation capable of expressing their modern existence. Both were essential in creating art cognizance and interest in Baghdad, instigating a culture that appreciated and collected modern Iraqi art before an official institution was even established. Consequently, Iraqi modern art would become an important identity marker for Iraqis till this day, and in fact was a very useful means of surviving during the sanctions of the 1990s and even 2003, which is when the rest of the world started collecting modern Iraqi art. But, growing up in Baghdad, I grew up with this art in my parents' house, their friends' houses, and so it was part of our daily life. No collectors, but everyone collected. Moreover, Iraqi intellectuals identify the gap between their aspirations and that of their public, particularly given the repressive political climate of the time. The establishment of the Friends of Art Society in 1941 signaled an important development for modern art in Iraq and paralleled a more formalized interest in the arts. It was also the first officially established organization registered at the Ministry of Interior and announced in the Istiqlal newspaper on March 25, 1941. The society included painters, sculptors, architects, and other art aficionados. The society held only 3 exhibitions, but played an important role during the turbulent years of World War II. As part of their program, they hosted cultural lectures and gatherings and discussed various topics. While World War II halted progress in Europe, as argued by Jewad Selim in one of his journal entries, who, I quote, stopped producing beautiful work, but Baghdad did not. It worked slowly and quietly. It was poor and uneducated, but it worked hard during these 4 to 5 years. The first art institute was established in 1941 and 1943, opened the sculpture department, as well as the first official atelier and the first strong movement in the theater and music. They were few who faced danger from all sides, from their creative work to preparing the public to appreciate and understand, end of quote. Following World War II, Iraqi artists took a more active role in their use of symbolic styles and choice of subject matter. Initially, Iraqis were shocked by the familiar of their changed lives and that they recognized on canvases by artists like Hafiz al-Drubi and Ata Sabri. In time, a pronounced tension between form and content gave the new experiments creative rhythm in the artist's anxious search for a form that could express their content without contradiction. This was particularly present in the work of Shakir Hassan and Jewad Selim, Iraq's renowned modern artists, exemplified in their participation to locate certain features of an Iraqi characteristic that was a widespread notion found in Iraqi literature of the 1950s. Led by Shakir Hassan, Society Primitive was formed in 1947 and then changed name to Ar-Ruwad in 1950. The group and Ar-Ruwad, it's normally translated to pioneers, but actually what Shakir Hassan was thinking was not pioneers of art, but they did all these sort of outdoor trips, and so it's like that the guy who was going to lead the group with a white sort of flag, and so everyone can follow him. And it was a joke between them. The group played an important role of providing a space for artists to intersect among themselves and then with society. Hassan was one of the early few who studied art in Paris on a scholarship from King Faisal II and graduated from the École nationale supérieure des beaux-arts in 1938. Jewad Selim was a member of Al-Ruwad following his return from London. In many ways, it was a logical step for him to want more. He had reached an understanding that the post-war period and struggles that led to the 1958 revolution necessitated new perspectives and directions in representation. The Baghdad Group for Modern Art, Jamaat Baghdad للفن الحديث, was thus established in 1951 by Jewad Selim and Shakir Hassan Al Said, like Hugo told us. Arguably, the group was formed at a pivotal moment to begin a crucial negotiation between a novice post-colonial national consciousness and modernism. Jewad Selim and Shakir Hassan Al Said were very different in temperament and background, but converged intellectually and ideologically. Selim was born in Ankara to a family of artists, to Iraqi parents who were positioned in Ankara at the time because his father was an officer in the army. And all of his brothers and sister became artists as well. He started studying sculpture on a government scholarship in Florence for 1 year, 1938 to 1939, but then relocated to Paris for a year between 1939 and 1940, and ultimately was forced by the spread of World War II to return to Baghdad. He later continued his studies after the end of war at the Slade School in London from 1946 to 1948, where he met his wife Lorna. Selim returned to Iraq in 1949 and became the head of the sculpture department at the Institute of Fine Arts. Al Said was born in the rural southern city of Samawa. He initially graduated with a degree in social sciences from the Higher Institute of Teachers in Baghdad in 1948. He later studied painting at the Institute of Fine Arts in Baghdad, graduating in 1954, where he encountered and was taught by Jewad Selim. Al Said later received a scholarship from 1955 to 1959 to study at the Académie Julian, École des Arts Décoratifs, and the École des Beaux-Arts. He thus was distant from the group during this period. While in Paris, in navigating an existential crisis, Al Said turned to phenomenology and existentialism and Sufism, which would profoundly inform and shift his work. When he returned to Baghdad, and so you can see some of his earlier work, and you'll see what I will talk about in a second, sort of the move to representation, and then you can see his work as developed through the years. When he returned to Baghdad, he taught art history at the Institute of Fine Arts and continued his research into the principles of istilham, which I will talk about in a second, that was introduced by the group. Perhaps with the absence of Selim's input and given his personal experience in Paris, Al Said's interest veered more into Islamic thought to achieve abstraction on an intellectual and spiritual level through the notion of transcendence. His 1960s work thus starts abandoning the narrative and performed to his contemplative art manifesto that he published in 1966. His experiments in istilham will take on multiple interesting and different directions that will require another talk. But just to sort of, put it within the context, Shakir Hassan Said lived long. He died in 2004, rather. He had a sort of this existential, or maybe it was a cultural shock because of his background in Paris, and started sort of investigating Sufism in depth. And that sort of got him to this notion of what he called istilham al-harf, then istilham al-jidar, then actually sort of this relationship between text and image in al-awfaq, talismanic formations of relationship between numbers and letters. And he influenced a large number of artists, contemporary artists, because he taught at the Institute for long. He was also at the museum. He was also a theoretician. And so his mark, and through him, the legacy of the Baghdad Group for Modern Art lived long. But back to Selim, who was by far the most influential of the group, particularly during his sort of short life. After the short period in Italy, which we don't really necessarily know much about, Selim left to Paris in October 1938 to study sculpture at the École de Beaux-Arts, possibly on the recommendation of Shakir Hassan, since Selim even stayed in the same lodging that Shakir had occupied during his time in Paris. Most of the accounts of Selim's time in Paris, his daughter Zainab asserts, as she mines the pages in preparation for the forthcoming catalogue raisonné, are based on the diary he kept and the letters to friends and family that he had copied in the diary. And yes, I'm happy to announce that there is a much needed catalogue raisonné happening and should be launched hopefully later this year. She tells us that Selim, I quote, was overwhelmed with the beauty and vibrancy of Paris before the Second World War. Jawad toured around Paris with, these are Jawad's words, with its secrets, institutes, museums, streets, young men and women, creativity, freedom, nights and days, taking in the sights. He was particularly bowled over, she says, by the number of statues on public view in the city. He referred to Paris as the City of Light, and he described the Trocadero with its grand staircases, beautiful statues, and water features, the center of the World Exhibition last year. The Latin quarters, museums, the Avenue des Champs-Élysées, and what he called the most beautiful thoroughfare in the world, where visions of beauty and magic pass along every day. Come and watch. He was intrigued by the fashionable and sometimes revealing clothes of the women. But at the École, Selim was assigned to the atelier of Marcel Gamon, who died in 1962, ironically a year after Selim died, known for his somber public bas-reliefs, but he was pending his entrance exams to become a full student. Selim did take his exams in March and became a full student in April. In mid-August, after the end of the term, Selim went on a holiday touring the French coast, as recorded in his notes in the diary, in photographs that he took of himself and watercolors that he painted of the scenery. The tour started in Saint-Malo and ended abruptly in Dinan when France joined the war. Selim was immediately recalled to Baghdad, where he later applied to transfer his studies to Rome. Historical circumstances thus mandated that Selim spends the war period in Iraq before finishing his studies at the Slade School in London after the end of the war. These were specifically key years for both Iraq and for the making of Jewad Selim the artist. His initial period abroad was abrupt, but served as a dynamic provocation that introduced him to modernist styles evolving in Europe, while equally assessing what he already knew about European art from the time being in Baghdad. While waiting for the war to be over, Jawad was appointed an instructor at the Institute of Fine Arts, as well as worked at the Iraqi Museum of Antiquity. The time in Baghdad was useful for him and for the art community. While Baghdad reflected the political, social, and intellectual turmoil of the period, it would also be a calmer host to artists and critics, Polish and British among them, passing by or stationed in the city during the war years, which provided a different context of international contact and exchange that was less overwhelming and allowed for better understanding and discussions. During this period, Selim was able to slowly process multiple threads that would materialize in his work after returning to Iraq in 1949. Moreover, in Baghdad, the charismatic and cosmopolitan Jawad was part of a wider conversation that addressed challenges in all aspects of the cultural and intellectual life, including poetry, architecture, and theater. He was aware of Iraqi artists' challenges and interest, having been part of artist collectives from the beginning of their establishment. It was thus not surprising that in time, Selim would grow unsatisfied with the objectives of the pioneer. The manifesto of the Baghdad Group for Modern Art was most likely written by Al Said, but expressed Selim's ideas into words. They say, "We thus announce today the beginning of a new school of painting, which derives its sources from the civilization of the contemporary age, with all the styles and schools of plastic art that have emerged from it, and from the unique character of Eastern civilization. In this way, we will honor the stronghold of the Iraqi art of painting that collapsed after the school of Yahya al-Wasiti, the Mesopotamian school of the 13th century AD. And in this way, we will reconnect the continuity that has been broken since the fall of Baghdad at the hands of the Mongols. The rebirth of art in our countries depends on the efforts we make, and we call upon our painter brothers to undertake this task for the sake of our civilization and for the sake of universal civilization, which is developed by the cooperation of different peoples. May the heritage of the present times and our awareness of local character be our guide. May we receive support from the attention, good taste, and encouragement that we anticipate from the public." End of quote. As you see, to him, the public was very important, that there is this relationship with the public, but also that there is this relationship with other parts of the world. And in that, you also see that the modern Iraqi artists were very sort of comfortable in that stance. The group's manifesto effectively intellectualized and canonized an approach to form to initiate a modern method of thinking about making art that would remain influential till today. They named it Istilham al-Turath. Istilham is an Arabic word that translates in its simplistic sense to seeking inspiration. Istilham al-Turath would thus specifically engage tradition through an innovative engagement with it. The notion of engaging Turath was not new in Iraqi art, but in its complex formulation by the group leaders, it came to exemplify a process based on drawing from history and contemporaneity, where the local is understood as their only claim for distinctive creativity to construct a unique and modern artistic vision. Istilham is a concept that mediates between the past and the present as a form of negotiation of heritage and tradition, with the aim to not replicate but project forward and realize contemporary aesthetics. Istilham is a word that I can't find an equivalent for in English without the explanation as I gave you. I don't know if it has an equivalent word in French, but in Arabic, when the notion is complex by invoking the word of Istilham. The group, which drew on the new and growing artistic consciousness in Iraq, equally revolted against naturalism in art, which had become mainstream in Baghdad by then, from all the students returning from Europe. More importantly, the group would provide Selim with an active space to negotiate the different ideas he had accumulated in the process, specifically his search for a balance between a new post-colonial national consciousness and what was perceived as a transnational modernism manifest in Europe. The list of artists who affiliated with the group would include all the main and influential modern artists of Iraq, and thus ensured that the ideas and principles of the group would be understood and were perhaps unconsciously internalized by the Iraqi art scene. The group continuously affirmed that each member was to retain a unique style, but all aimed to navigate through the history of Iraqi culture to further develop that individual style and be able to visualize the country, the land, and its cultures in a modern manner. There was a short period of time that one sees the affinity in the work of the artists themselves as they were working together and speaking to each other and critiquing each other's work and following within the same theories, but they all sort of then diverged in different directions. Much has been written about identity politics as it was interpreted visually to assert new national iconography following Iraq's independence as a sovereign nation, trying to find its people's potential. Selim, the humanist, with high hopes for the people, mined all material available in his cachet. He argued, I quote, "The artist who seeks to reach his goal must devote all his strength and life to it. He must digest everything old to bring in the new. And what is this old but an enormous world?" End of quote. This was Jawad's modus operandi throughout his career. He worked hard to create and surpass local concerns to reach humanity. There is no doubt that Jewad was aware of the modern artist in Europe and admired work of Picasso, Matisse, and Henry Moore, to name few. As all students do, he too analyzed their work and experimented with their modern styles and formulations, as he also did with the work of Sumerian artist and Abbasid Yahya al-Wasiti. He thought of himself as the descendant of all this heritage and understood that modernism had its roots in his heritage as well. Jawad's discourse was confrontational, both national and modern, forcing the public to engage with the new traditions he and his contemporary artists were creating. His work instigated his contemporaries to find renewal within historical roots. This was specifically why the legacy of Jewad Selim became much larger than his short life and career. Selim accepted modern art in Iraq to express the problematic of the new art they were practicing, oil painting on canvas following modern styles that were seen as foreign to Iraqis. The notion of istilham, thus, was to resolve this tension between the new styles artists learned in art schools in Europe and a historical visual wealth that they were learning anew at the Museum of Antiquity and the recovered images of the 13th century Maqamat al-Hariri assemblies, in particular in the paintings of Yahya al-Wasiti. The encounter with al-Wasiti came through images published in the French journal the Illustrations in December 1938, with an introduction by the French art historian Eustache Deloré. The journal was brought to Baghdad by artist Atta Sabri from London in 1941 that he found while he was traveling, and then it was copied, enlarged, and studied by the artist in the Museum of Antiquity. Maqamat al-Hariri visually represented the events, stories, and anecdotes of al-Hariri's daily life encounters in Baghdad and Basra. The Maqamat is the only manuscript from the Baghdad School of Painting that survived the burning of Baghdad by the Mongols during the 13th century. While the text of the Maqamat has been celebrated for its dexterity, the accompanying images are extremely engaging. The most celebrated illustrated copy of the manuscript, renowned for the conceptual sophistication, scale, and quality of its images, was calligraphed and painted by Yahya al-Wasiti, an Iraqi probably from Baghdad in 1237 CE. Characteristics of the Baghdad school of painting included a dialectic merger between text and image. Now, what is even interesting that I discovered 2 years ago, on a trip to Baghdad, I walked into the Baghdad Hotel, the famous Baghdad Hotel, and behind the register there was a tapestry of one of, actually the one that you see, this one, of a maqamat. That really intrigued me, and I asked, and they said, yeah, maybe we can find you some in the antique market, because apparently they wove them into tapestries in the 1950s. So they copied them, they studied them, they made them into tapestries, and I was actually able to buy find two of them in Baghdad. probably the carpet merchant thought I was sort of strange. Why am I looking specifically for those? But this sort of tells you the importance of Maqamat al-Hariri for modern Iraqi artists of the time. Al-Wasiti and the images thus served as a main facilitator for the members of the group in forming their theories and aesthetics. Al Said, Shakir Hassan Al Said, published his analysis of few images of the maqamat in a booklet titled The Artistic and Social Characteristics of Al-Wasiti's Drawings in 1964. The title pretty much speaks of how Al-Said saw the work of Al-Wasiti and Al-Wasiti himself as an artist whose work addresses social, racial, and class issues, as well as develops a specific aesthetics for negotiating them. He wrote, quote, "It is not an illusion that an Iraqi painter arises from the first half of the 7th century AH, after Hijri, with the same skills as a modern painter," end of quote. He located Al-Wasiti's roots in Mesopotamian traditions, further explaining that, another quote, "as part of the accomplishments of the ancient civilizations in Iraq, that the Mesopotamian artist chose to develop a unique creative genius, which is undoubtedly Al-Wasiti's heritage," end of quote. And of course, by extension, he's looking at the medieval Wasiti as Mesopotamian, and by extension, his generation of Iraqi artists. So Istilham became the catalyst and mediator for renewal in painting, although it would extend to the other medias in time. Of course, after all, Jewad Selim was a sculptor before being a painter. Through Istilham, Selim and Said's journey to abstraction and further national significance beyond had further national significance beyond modernism. Al-Said would argue that abstraction for Iraqi artists represented a view of the world from a purely Arab perspective. They arrived at a specific modern iconography through exploring the wealth of symbols found in the different periods of Iraqi history. For example, Selim negotiated the duality of the two basic shapes, the circle and square, or their components, within which he maintained a dynamic visual rhythm based on contrast. But you see on this slide, Selim's Caliph's company that he did in 1953, where he's applying some of the aesthetics that I will talk about in a second, but he's also reimagining some of the stories from Maqamat al-Hariri. Selim's mature aesthetics are most manifest in his series. You know what, I'm not even looking at time, sorry. So just motion me if I don't stop talking in time. Selim's mature aesthetics are most manifest in his series of Baghdadiyat, painted in the 1950s. In its naming, Selim referenced both the Abbasid Baghdad school of painting and the contemporary city of Baghdad. Baghdadiyat thus at once forges a historical continuity and expresses the contemporaneity of his manifestation. Baghdadiyat, however, presented a very provocative discourse in the context of the historical and political realities of the city ruled under emergency law by Nouri Said and its people facing corruption, shortages of food, and political oppression. The images of Baghdadiyat, thus by their negation of reality, ideologically resist the status quo and projected a better yet imagined future. In avoiding direct politics, Selim emphasized his focus on humanity and their struggles. Analytically intellectualizing popular themes into high art, Selim sought to de-exoticize and de-orientalize representation. Of interest is that the Iraqi critic and writer Suhail Nader sees the series as, I quote, a small and stories, end of quote. They thus represent a specific case of Istilham in their content as well as their aesthetics, where Turath is the internal force and Istilham is the mechanism. Selim's painting of the 1950s also introduced what became known as hilaliyat, crescent-like shapes. In these works, Selim abstracts both ideas and forms into stylized gestural articulations in crescent shapes that further exemplify the tension of the concept of duality. Sumerian traditions were negotiated in the frontal positions of the faces of his figures with big almond-shaped eyes formed by two horizontally joined crescents. An arabesque was produced by the repetition of curvilinear and angular shapes. Figures that generally dominate Selim's composition, emphasizing the centrality of humanity in his work, were generally transformed into objects of aesthetics, abstracted and ornamented into linear patterns. One can argue that his non-linear approach to repetition implements an important aspect of Islamic aesthetics based on interaction and juxtaposition of diverse units. The duality of past and present is further presented at times by the tension between the two-dimensionality of the figure and the three-dimensionality of some of the objects in the scene. A good example of this duality is seen in the painting of the Great Mosque of Al-Kufa that emphasizes the architecture of the Great Mosque of Al-Kufa. Selim here explores the layers of history and indexes changes in symbolism displayed on the minarets and on the facades. A storyteller in all his work, in the series of Baghdadiyat, Selim tells the story of the city that once was, but lives in the collective imagination as fed by stories from 1001 Nights and Abbasid artifacts. Arguably, the series has been loosely grouped by his contemporary historians and critics into three categories of paintings. One having its source in folk life and tradition, the second in vernacular artifacts, for a lack of a better word, remembering our discussion yesterday, Ziad, for being unusually devoid of people. These paintings generally identify different popular symbols of a perceived traditional Baghdadi neighborhoods and households. They study forms of different objects and they study forms of different objects that populate daily life, and as such, point to the people who would use them without featuring them. In Portrait of a Lorry, this one, Jawad divides the canvas into three registers that structure the painting upwards, evoking format of an Islamic miniature. The tension between the past and present is materialized in the dominance of the lorry at the bottom register of the painting. A symbol of construction and change, it is positioned in both frontal and side views, as if turning to proceed towards us. While foreboding in its size, it appears to carry the stacks of traditional architecture features that evoke old neighborhoods in Baghdad, as if emerging from the old city, but equally merging with it. Reflecting folk practices, the lorry has the phrase, "God is the protector," written on its side, invoking God's presence for protection against evil and the unknown. In one of Selim's most iconic work from the series, fitting its name Baghdadiyat, he gives us a composite image of a popular, albeit generic, in its non-specificity and abstraction, Baghdad neighborhood. The seemingly unfinished sketch of a painting houses a myriad of vignettes that are as sequestered as they flow into each other and encompasses the three groups mentioned above that he would elucidate in specific paintings later. While they all exist in the space of the canvas, Selim creates pockets of activities that seem to be organized into two registers. We look at it with this sort of upper and lower register. Highlighting the format of Sumerian steles, where the temporal sequence is not necessarily linear, telling a narrative of its time. On the lower register, from right to left, we see a woman carrying a basket on her head, another woman perhaps washing clothes in the river with two girls playing next to her, then two dogs in confrontations with each other. Incidentally, we've realized lately that, you don't see many cats in Iraqi art, but you do see a lot of dogs, and apparently everything we believe about bad luck associated with cats does come from Sumerian times. They thought of cats as, ominous. And these two dogs, they're just beautiful sort of dogs that Selim gives us. a man on a bicycle with 2 children, and on the bottom left, a child asking his mother to get him what looks like a popsicle from the street vendor. On the upper register, from the right, we see 2 women speaking to each other over the terrace, over the fence, which is a very common thing that happens in the city. Next, there are 2 musicians and children dancing, a clip that references Jewad's music in the street painting that I showed you earlier. A woman looking out of an arched window, another woman and 2 men seated on a table, while a man on the far left is cooking mazgoof fish. Here, there's that woman in the window. The vignettes are all located outdoors, with vague palm trees references on top, in the far horizon, and a full moon. Architecture is only seen on the upper left, where we see 2 houses facing each other. The one on the right has a window and evokes traditional architecture with the arched window, sort of a simplified shanashil, and decorative roof over the portico. On the left, there is a modern structure. Selim's people who inhabit this painting are all in traditional attire, except for the 3 seated individuals waiting for their ancient Sumerian traditional mazgoof meal. They are positioned in the space between the 2 houses and demarcated by a horizontal swath of gray color as their ground. Within its formal structure as a work of art, Selim creates an explicit rhythm connected through his undulating line and distribution of form and color. He creates a quietly active scene of happening while he equally resolves issues of representation through the hilaliyat aesthetics. The upper left corner of the painting, however, interrupts the flow of the rhythm perceived through the rest of the painting. Moreover, the frontality of the woman in modern attire, seated with the 2 men, but emphasized by color, nods to Edward Manet's Le Déjeuner sur l'eau as an act of defiance. What does it mean to place the modern woman in the painting to be facing her viewer, while all the others who inhabit the painting are busy engaged with activities of sorts? Particularly as the other woman looking out from the window is placed behind bars that evoke a cage, demarcated also by the other horizontal band of olive green color. Her line of vision seems to follow the woman in modern clothing. Selim uses these horizontal swaths for emphasis and visual directions, for sure. I should show you a little bit of a larger close-up of these images, the little vignettes. Salim's experiment with line and form, as well as his exploration of hilaliyat, as seen in aesthetics, are present in all of his series, but is exemplified in Children's Game, or Children Playing. With a similar use of registers and vignettes, Jewad democratizes the multiple symbols of their connotation and their connotations between the past, present, and future within the space of the painting. The active scene creates a balanced symphony of straight lines and curves, geometric and organic shapes that are, as Al Said argues, and I quote, equally distant from and close to cubism, end of quote. What they do is invoke a new system of decorative negotiation of the surface through repetition of shapes and their movement within the narrative introduced. Ultimately, in these series of paintings, Selim arrives at what I term line-mediated aesthetics, present before but perfected here, where the pictorial and ornamental collapses and the surface articulation negotiates both form and content with symbolic, expressive, abstract, and narrative-driven qualities that would be the identity signature of Iraqi art. Through the line-mediated aesthetics, Selim employs the decorative not as an end, but rather as a methodology of mediating modernism and a visual and stylistic lineage, and as a way of navigating space. In its precarious and ambiguous relationship with modernism in Europe, the decorative had been equated with the primitive and expressive in modern art, as was formulated at the turn of the 20th century. This was particularly poignant with regard to non-European points of references, like African masks and Islamic ornamentations, for example, and the notion of the barbarian. While in certain ways the decorative indexed modernity in European art, it was equally and pejoratively used to signify ornamentation of the applied arts perceived as dead by European modernists. For the Iraqi avant-garde, distinguished in their social efficacy, the decorative was not an end in itself, but rather a methodology of mediating modernism and visual and artistic lineage. If Islamic art is argued to have given Matisse a solution for his interest in the decorative, for the Iraqi artist, the decorative facilitated the connection between their past and their present through istilham. The decorative in Iraqi modern art would denote honesty in painting and the line as direct surface manipulation of expressive and at times symbolic qualities. The work thus did not perceive any tension between the decorative and the pictorial. The decorative has also been used to emphasize the unimaginative qualities and rigidity of Islamic art based on its religious interdictions in relationship to images, stylized forms with preference to drawing over painting from observation. One thus can easily argue that it is a specific act of resistance by Iraqi artists to transform the Islamic artist's mastery of drawing and the arabesque, what has been described by many Orientalists as rigid and lifeless ornament, into a dynamic image of the modern age. Jewad tells us in a few letters to friends that he was tormented between sculpture and painting. His paintings reveal no such tensions. On the contrary, it is in his paintings that he negotiates the concept of istilham to its conclusion, although one can see its interpretation in sculpture as well. Nonetheless, Jewad Selim did not trust his abilities as a painter, and he always perceived that sculpture would be the better vehicle for his self-expression. He wrote in one of his journal entries in 1944, "I think in form and mass more than I do in color." Jewad's proposal for the unknown political prisoner in 1952 exemplified all the ideas he was contemplating in his paintings of the period. Unlike his earlier sculpture, Al Said tells us that Jewad Selim traded space for mass here to express the abstractness of the concept of an unknown political prisoner itself. The subject to him, thus, was an eternal one that has no specific features to be expressed in his usual manipulation of mass. The rhythmic composition of the sculpture could easily tip the balance between movement and stability, manifest through the solidity and malleability of the material. Here, too, the crescent has its trace. Struggle and passion, among other qualities, were part of Jewad's restlessness between painting and sculpture. Perhaps these qualities are best seen in Jewad's final work, Nasb al-Hurriya, the Freedom Monument, or Monument of Freedom. The critic Jabra Ibrahim Jabra argues that the monument reflects the culmination of what he identifies as three interrelated facets in Jewad's work: his individual creative genius, his search into a national being, and his search into a regional and local heritage. These aspects sum up what occupied Iraqis for most of the 20th century and drove their overall creativity. In many ways, Jewad's artistic trajectory anticipated the creation of the monument. He, after all, had predicted that Iraq had the space to excel in sculpture given its ancient history despite the contemporary lack of object manifestation. Selim had previous opportunities to develop proposals for public sculpture in Baghdad, yet they were all declined for one reason or another. Thus, this project was of immense importance for him, and more so for Iraq, as it is the first post-independence public monument executed by and designed by Iraq's most prominent sculptor. The story of Nasb al-Hurriya is equally a story of friendship and a unique negotiation between an architect and artist based on mutual trust and admiration. Architect Rafat Chadirchi was commissioned to design and erect three different public monuments by Majlis Amanat al-Asima, the Baghdad City Municipality Council, following the July Revolution of 1958. 2 out of 3 were accomplished: Nasb al-Jundi al-Majhul, the monument of unknown soldier that he designed, and the Freedom Monument, which folded 2 of the discussed monuments, one celebrating the 14th of July and another dedicated for freedom, into one. That became Nasb al-Hurriya. Chaderchi lists Jewad Selim first on the list of 7 people who had specifically inspired him. In his dedication to Jewad, Chaderchi particularly appreciates Jewad's determination as an artist to fulfill his most important duty based on the realization that historical conditions in Iraq had resulted in the lack of sculpture. It was thus only expected that when the opportunity arose for a new public monument, Chaderchi would engage Jewad, who embarked on fulfilling the potential for excellence in his this deficiency and set out to fill the creative gap. The friendship between Jewad and Chaderchi grew from admiration as a young man looking up to Jewad Selim to later finding in him a kindred spirit. Chaderchi knew Selim as a persona before knowing him as a man. He actually learned about modern art from stories that he heard Jewad Selim had told. Chaderchi knew it was in London while studying architecture that Chaderchi grew to know Jewad better. Between 1946 and 1948, they met often, visited exhibitions, attended plays, and spoke of art. Chaderchi thought of Selim as a, I quote, person with whom I shared sentiments without speaking a word, a friend where my thoughts take refuge like a drifter would in a safe shelter, end of quote. Equally, Selim trusted Chaderchi with his work and shared his new ideas and experiments with him. In navigating the proposed site and ideas, Chaderchi envisioned the monument as a billboard, a banner in the language of modern advertisement appearing around the modern city. He thought of it as an aesthetic replacement of what he deemed to be ugly visual cropping up around Baghdad in the billboards. He set its width to be that of the Ummah garden, Hadiqat al-Ummah, that is behind it, formerly known as Ghazi Garden, and built a large travertine superstructure on a concrete core, 50 by 10 meters in size, which was erected in 1959. But he equally wanted to evoke an extension of an Assyrian structure that he would achieve through light manipulation, and hence it's high up there. He envisioned 3 sections of relief that would articulate the pre-revolution, the revolution, and the post-revolution, to be read from right to left. Chaderchi thought of the monument as an eternal documentation of the 14th of July revolution. He was right. It remains the only unaltered modern Iraqi public monument in the city. These specific ideas that negotiated both a modern phenomenon and ancient monument further reinforced his initial idea to ask Jewad to design the relief, which was to be cast in bronze and mounted on the stone slab. The trust that had grown between the two was further manifest in the ensuing process with all its challenges. Beyond the main concept, Chaderchi allowed Jewad Selim complete freedom of iconography and design, with particularly no specific directions nor advance approval of the design needed. And Chaderchi would often shield Selim from actual negotiation with the government to allow him to focus on his art. There are many rumors of what the government wanted to include, like, for example, the image of the Brigadier Abdul Karim Qasim, which one could argue maybe is what that soldier in the middle here represents. But luckily, with no feature references, so it escaped Saddam Hussein's eyes, for example. When Selim delivered the finished pieces in installments between 1959 and 1960, because they were being cast in Florence, Chaderchi wrote of his excitement with opening each crate. Selim died in January 1961 in Baghdad while the final installations of the pieces were taking place. As revered as Jawad is for Iraqi art, and as celebrated as the monument is, there is much that remains unknown and subject to rumors and myth. In his reevaluation of the monument, Jabra cautions that we must understand and delve into Jewad Selim's work within its temporal framework. We must see it within the social and political context of Selim's art, Selim's Iraq and Arab world. For example, the much debated role of the horse in the monument must be seen in connection to the city's previous public sculptures, which included two equestrian statues, one of General Stanley Mode, erected in 1923, and one of King Faisal I, created in 1933, both of which were pulled down by the people celebrating the 1958 revolution and excising the history of the mandate. Also, both statues that resonated with Jawad were the work of European artists. Seeing the sketches of the monument as a series leading to the final piece of the relief, one can see the transformation between painting and sculpture in Selim's work. They make manifest his process of thinking between line and form, as well as his understanding of the revolution as an important shift in the history of his country. In fact, in one of his sketches, that is part of the Chadarchi collection, there are references to earlier dates of significance in Iraq history, including the 1920 revolution, 1932, indicating the establishment of the Kingdom of Iraq. This is particularly unusual given that throughout his career, Selim did not confront what was deemed political in his work. Back to the group of modern art. The group held annual exhibitions and continued till 1971. However, following Selim's untimely death in 1961, and despite efforts by Al Said to hold the group together, their vision and momentum was fragmented, particularly as the 1960s brought with it different demands and directions for artists. Their impact, however, resonates still today. Their objectives and work advance the specific understanding of the visual as it would relate to the revitalized dynamic culture. They brought together artists who shared the aspirations for a new visual language capable of assessing their visual distinctiveness within a world of multiplicity and intersections. As artists of the Baghdad Group for Modern Art engaged in reimagining Iraqi culture through abstraction, they situated modernism in Iraq on a progressive path that equally contributed to the formation of modern Iraqi identities. More importantly, the conversations they started, the concepts they introduced, and the spirit of experimentation and innovation were to continue through the work of its former members and their students after them, allowing for their cultural identities to incessantly evolve. Their definition of self from the beginning involved a continuity of a perceived national history, the individual visions, reconstructing and negotiating tradition and visual expressions became an important part in the creativity and cultural education of a nation, as did the relationship between artist and public's appreciation of modern art. To Iraqis, their modern art is a national heritage and a reason for pride. Thank you for your attention.